The president speaking in the White House moments ago, talking about border issues, Iran, the China trade deal, but beginning and ending with these protests in Hong Kong that were really historic today. Today, on the 20th anniversary of the announcement that China would be now in control again of Hong Kong, but have a 50-year hiatus during which they would not interfere. They sort of violated that, and the people of Hong Kong don't like that violation, and they are out in the streets today. They were not only out in the streets, but they actually went to the legislature there in Hong Kong. We have video that we could show. They banged on the windows, then broke the windows, then went into the legislature itself. So where will this all end? Let's bring in the Heritage Foundation's Dean Cheng to talk more about this. Dean, will these protests do anything to protect democracy in Hong Kong?
Well, the problem is that on the one hand, what we're seeing is the people of Hong Kong are very unhappy with the government, which had been trying to push through an extradition treaty which would allow people to be extradited to China. But by breaking into the legislature, they are also creating the real possibility of a crackdown backed by Beijing, who would use this as an excuse to prevent mob rule.
Dean, Jonas Ferris here. That's actually what I was going to ask you about. Is it seems like a lot of these countries that are questionable democracies, based on what Trump was just saying, like Russia, there's a lot of protests now that are building steam. What can they do in China? Like, they can't have this win because then people in China might start protesting and try to get somewhere with that, and they wouldn't allow that. So they almost have to crack down on this. Their hands are sort of tied. Like, what's the avenue here besides a hard crackdown by China, even in this independent region?
Well, what we saw with the umbrella movement a couple of years ago was actually a pretty smart effort by the authorities to really starve the protests of attention. They didn't crack down. They basically left them alone. And after several days, the media packed up and went home. After a couple more days, a lot of the protesters packed up and went home. At some point, when there were really just a few, relatively few people remaining, is when the police then came in, cleared them out without using force. But since then, a lot of the organizers have found that their passports have been revoked. They can't get permission to leave the country. So it is possible to do a sort of velvet glove, relative hands-off approach. But once you have action like taking over the legislature, that's when I think the authorities feel they have to act.
So these protests have turned violent, and obviously the protesters want to scrap the extradition bill. But how likely do you think that's going to happen? What are the odds of that?
Well, Carrie Lam, the head of Hong Kong, has withdrawn or tabled the extradition treaty. The problem is that she has only tabled it. She has not fully withdrawn it. So the people who are protesting are saying, you know, you guys might come back in the dead of night, a week, a year from now, and try and reintroduce this. This is, I think, part of the frustration that you're seeing among, especially the younger people who are the ones who are doing the takeovers and breaking into the buildings.
I've never seen frustration like it, and it is justified frustration. We should emphasize, Dean, we had to cut it short because of the president there. We thank you very much for being here. Thanks very much. Please come back.